I never told my parents about my $100,000 a month salary. So when my sister screamed for me to get out and called me a beggar, my parents just stood there and watched as she threw my belongings out the front door. 1 week later, I bought the $4.5 million estate directly across the street. Then they saw my name on the deed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Julia. I am 33 years old, and for my entire life I was the designated failure of my family. The heavy thud of my battered suitcase hitting the wooden porch steps echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood, each bounce sounding like a gavel striking a judge's block. I watched as the cheap zipper finally gave way under the pressure, bursting open and scattering my carefully folded clothes across my parents' perfectly manicured front lawn. A pair of dark denim jeans landed in the pristine flower bed, crushing a row of delicate petunias. A handful of cotton shirts draped themselves over the cold concrete walkway. Standing in the doorway, her face contorted in a vicious sneer, was my younger sister Brittany. At 30 years old, she had perfected the art of looking down on me, a skill nurtured and rewarded by our parents since we were children. She wore a tailored designer blazer, her hair flawlessly styled, and an expression of absolute disgust that marred her otherwise pretty features. "Get out, beggar!" She screamed, her voice shrill enough to make the neighbors' curtains twitch across the street. "I need this room for my new walk-in closet. My clothes are getting ruined, crammed in the guest room dressers, and you have overstayed your welcome." I did not cry. I did not scream back. I simply walked down the steps and calmly bent down to retrieve my belongings from the damp grass. This was the same childhood home I had grown up in, a picturesque, sprawling house in an affluent neighborhood where appearances meant everything. I had returned for a brief 1-week visit, hoping to share some personal news, only to find myself relegated to my old, cramped bedroom while Brittany paraded her latest real estate listings around the dining table. As I picked up my favorite sweater, my parents Thomas and Linda stepped onto the porch. They had heard the commotion, of course. In any normal family, parents would intervene when one sibling throws another sibling's possessions out the door. But my family was far from normal. Linda, clutching her morning cup of specialty coffee, looked down at me from the elevated porch and let out a long, theatrical sigh of annoyance. Her eyes swept over my practical jeans and simple sweater, finding me lacking as she always did. Instead of reprimanding Brittany for her hostile outburst, my mother weaponized my past through immediate action. "If you had just stuck with the receptionist job we found you 5 years ago, instead of playing make-believe on the internet, you would not be 33 and homeless right now," she said, her voice dripping with thick, suffocating condescension. "Look at your sister. She is closing million-dollar real estate deals. She is building a real future with a respectable man. You need to learn your place, Julia. You cannot just drift through life expecting handouts from successful people." Her words were meant to cut, to remind me of the long-established family hierarchy. Brittany was the golden child, the successful luxury real estate agent who brought prestige and bragging rights to the family name. I was the scapegoat, the one whose remote, highly technical career was completely invisible to their status-obsessed eyes. Because I worked from my computer and did not wear a suit to a corporate office downtown, they genuinely believed I spent my days messing around online, achieving absolutely nothing of value. I dusted off my clothes and repacked the broken suitcase, forcing the broken zipper closed as best as I could. I looked up at the three of them standing on the porch, a united front of hostility. "I just need the keys to my car," I said quietly, referencing the 10-year-old sedan I had driven since my early 20s. I had left the keys on the kitchen counter that morning. My father Thomas reached into his tailored slacks. He pulled out my familiar key ring, the silver charm catching the sunlight, but instead of tossing it down to me, he closed his fist tight around it. His expression was cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of paternal warmth. Actually, he said, his voice hard and uncompromising, "We are giving this car to Kyle." Kyle was Brittany's new fiancé, a man who shared her arrogant disposition and expensive tastes. I stood up straight, confusion breaking through my practiced calm. That is my car, Dad. I bought it myself. I have the title. Thomas sneered, stepping forward to the edge of the porch. It is a congratulatory gift for Brittany and Kyle's engagement, he declared as if my ownership of the vehicle was completely irrelevant. Consider it your back rent for the week you stayed in your childhood room eating our food and taking up space that your sister needs. You owe us for raising you, Julia. We are keeping the car. The sheer audacity of the theft left me momentarily speechless. They were stranding me in the driveway, stealing my only mode of transportation and framing it as a debt I somehow owed them for the privilege of being their unwanted daughter. Brittany crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She loved seeing me put in my place. She loved knowing that in this house she could take whatever she wanted from me, and our parents would violently applaud her for it. In the past, this was the exact moment where I would have broken down. I would have cried, begged, or tried to reason with them. I would have desperately sought their approval, apologizing for whatever imaginary slight had provoked their sudden anger. But I was no longer the insecure, terrified girl they had conditioned me to be. I wordlessly turned my back on my family. I did not hurl insults, demand justice, or make empty threats about police involvement. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen cool against my fingers, and opened a ride-sharing app. I bypassed the standard economical options I would have chosen in my 20s and decisively booked an Uber Black. As I stood in the driveway waiting for my luxury transport to arrive, a banking notification softly chimed and illuminated my screen. Monthly corporate dividend deposit, $100,000. I stared at the glowing numbers, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me, settling deep into my bones. The money was just a regular distribution, a fraction of my actual net worth. I had never told them the truth about my make-believe internet job. I had never mentioned that the software I developed in my tiny apartment to manage logistics for global e-commerce brands had exploded in value, or that I was the founder and CEO of a highly lucrative technology firm. They had never bothered to ask about my life, and I had long ago stopped trying to share my triumphs with people who only wanted to see me fail. I swiped the notification away and looked up from my phone. Directly across the street from my parents' house sat a magnificent luxury estate. It was a sprawling modern masterpiece with towering windows, immaculate landscaping, and a price tag of $4.5 million. A prominent for sale sign stood proudly on its front lawn, catching the morning sunlight. I looked at the estate, then back over my shoulder at the dilapidated porch where my family stood smug and self-satisfied in their cruel little kingdom. They thought they had finally broken me. They thought they had stripped me of my dignity and left me with absolutely nothing. A dangerous smile touched my lips as the sleek black car pulled up to the curb. I climbed into the back seat, leaving my stolen sedan and my toxic family behind, already formulating the plan that would dismantle their entire world. The leather seats of the luxury car were cool and quiet, providing a sharp and welcome contrast to the chaotic front lawn I had just left behind. I leaned back against the headrest and watched through the tinted glass as the picturesque facade of my childhood home disappeared from view. I took a deep breath to steady my racing pulse. I did not shed a single tear over the stolen sedan or the cruel words hurled at me. By the time my private driver pulled up to the valet stand of the downtown Grand Hotel, my mind had already shifted gears. I was no longer the unwanted daughter being thrown out like yesterday's garbage. I was the chief executive officer of a prominent technology company that handled the complex back-end logistics for some of the largest e-commerce brands in the world. I stepped into the private elevator and used my secure keycard to access the top-floor penthouse suite. The sprawling space offered a magnificent panoramic view of the city skyline, but I ignored the scenery. I walked straight to the massive glass dining table, opened my laptop, and connected to my secure encrypted network. I had a critical board meeting in 10 minutes. I ordered a pot of green tea from room service and smoothed the wrinkles out of my plain cotton sweater. I did not need a designer blazer or a flashy wardrobe to command respect in my professional world. My screen quickly populated with the faces of my top executives. We immediately dove into the detailed quarterly financial reports. Our software platform was currently processing billions of commercial transactions, predicting complex supply chain bottlenecks, and securing digital payment gateways against global cyber threats. The numbers displayed on my screen were staggering, indicating record-breaking profits for the fourth consecutive quarter. But my chief financial officer, David, looked concerned about a specific line item on the expenditure sheet. He leaned forward into his webcam and cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "Julia, I am looking at the proposed budget cuts for the third quarter server upgrades." He said, his brow furrowed with worry. "I understand we want to maximize our profit margins before the next investor call. But if we slash their funding this drastically, the development team is going to freeze under the pressure. We cannot just cut off their resources without warning and expect them to figure it out on their own. They need a financial safety net to fall back on while they adapt to the new framework." Those specific words struck a raw nerve deep inside my chest. We cannot just cut off their resources without warning. The audio of the virtual meeting faded slightly, as my mind was violently pulled back 12 years into the past. I was 21 years old, standing in the cramped kitchen of my parents' house, clutching an unpaid tuition bill for my community college classes. My mother, Linda, was sitting at the kitchen island excitedly reviewing glossy travel brochures with a pen in her hand. I had asked her why the tuition check had bounced. She did not even look at me when she delivered the news. She casually explained that Brittany simply had to study abroad in Paris for the summer to expand her cultural horizons and secure her social standing among her wealthy peers. The money they had promised me for my associate degree had been silently reallocated to fund my sister's lavish European vacation. When I panicked and asked how I was supposed to finish my semester without that funding, my father Thomas had shrugged his shoulders. He told me to figure it out on my own and stop acting like a burden to the family. I clearly remembered the bitter, biting cold of the unheated studio apartment I was forced to move into a week later. I remembered wearing 2 pairs of socks and fingerless wool gloves just to keep my hands warm enough to type on the keyboard. I could not afford to go back to school, so I spent working as a receptionist and hunched over a secondhand laptop, teaching myself how to code. I survived on cheap noodles and tap water, writing the foundational algorithms that would eventually become my multi-million-dollar software empire. I did not have a safety net. I had a wall of solid ice in my own bare hands to claw my way over it. I blinked rapidly, pulling myself back to the present moment. I stared through the webcam at David, channeling the cold, ruthless survival instinct that had kept me alive in that freezing apartment all those years ago. "Cut the budget," I commanded, my voice entirely flat and echoing with absolute authority. "If the development team is as good as they claim to be, they will find a more efficient way to write the code. Hunger breeds innovation. Make the cuts, David." I ended the virtual meeting without waiting for his reply and closed my laptop with a firm click. The heavy silence of the luxury penthouse felt incredibly satisfying. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my wealth manager, Paul. He answered on the first ring, ready to execute whatever financial directive I had for him today. "Paul, I need you to facilitate a real estate transaction for me immediately," I said, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows to look down at the bustling city streets. "There is a luxury property listed for $4.5 million in the suburbs." I gave him the exact address, the beautiful estate directly across the street from my parents' house. "I want you to buy it today. Pay the full asking price in cash. Do not attempt to negotiate the rate, just secure the deed as fast as humanly possible. And Paul, I want the purchase made through a newly formed corporate shell company to obscure my identity. Ensure that the transaction completely bypasses the listing brokerage that currently holds the property. Do not let them anywhere near the commission." Paul assured me the paperwork would be drafted and finalized before the banks closed for the day. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing contract proposals and enjoying the quiet luxury of my suite, sipping tea and watching the city below. Hours passed in absolute tranquility. Then, just as the sun began to dip below the city skyline, casting a warm orange glow across the glass table, my phone vibrated violently against the surface. It was a rapid succession of text messages from Brittany. I unlocked the screen and read the expletive-laden paragraphs. She was losing her mind. An anonymous buyer had just closed on the $4.5 million estate across the street from our parents' house. The buyer had intentionally gone directly through the seller's legal team, entirely cutting out Brittany's luxury real estate brokerage from the transaction. She had been banking on that massive commission to secure a highly coveted promotion to junior partner at her firm, and it had just vanished into thin air, leaving her with absolutely nothing to show for her arrogant boasting. Exactly 7 days passed since the morning I was ordered off my parents' front porch like a stray dog. In that short span of time, the massive transaction had cleared seamlessly. The corporate shell company I had established operated flawlessly, securing the $4.5 million estate directly across the street without a single hitch. The former owners handed over the keys, eager for the swift cash payout and completely unaware of the familial warfare they were facilitating. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 3 large unmarked moving trucks pulled into the wide circular driveway of my new property. I had hired a private luxury relocation service from the city, paying a premium for their absolute discretion. I stood near the heavy iron gates, giving the foreman clear and strict instructions. They were to bypass the grand double doors at the front of the estate entirely. Instead, I directed them to use the service entrances hidden behind the tall, meticulously manicured privacy hedges that lined the eastern edge of the property. I wanted my arrival to be a ghost story. I did not want my family to look out their front window and see furniture being carried in. I wanted the house to appear as silent and impenetrable as a fortress. The movers worked with quiet efficiency, carrying my sleek modern furniture and high-tech server equipment through the side doors. I spent the morning directing traffic, making sure the massive mahogany desk for my home office was positioned perfectly, and ensuring the Homeland Security-grade network servers were installed in the climate-controlled basement. The entire operation was an exercise in invisible power. I wore a pair of faded gray sweatpants and an oversized college hoodie, comfortable in my own skin and my own domain. By mid-afternoon, the trucks had backed out as quietly as they had arrived, leaving no trace of the massive transition that had just taken place. With the house finally to myself, I took a moment to breathe it all in. I walked up the sweeping, curved staircase, tracing my hand along the polished oak railing. The sheer scale of the estate was intoxicating. It smelled of fresh paint, lemon oil, and quiet luxury. I made my way into the master bedroom suite, which spanned the entire front section of the second floor. The room featured a wall of massive floor-to-ceiling windows that provided an unobstructed bird's-eye view of the street below. I stepped up to the pristine glass and looked down at my parents' house. From this elevated vantage point, the place where I had grown up looked incredibly small and insignificant. The petunias I had accidentally crushed were still visible in the flower bed, a tiny reminder of my violent eviction. But what truly captured my attention was the frantic energy radiating from my parents' driveway. The news of a cash buyer snatching up the most expensive property in the neighborhood had clearly reached Thomas and Linda. The arrival of a mysterious billionaire neighbor was the exact kind of high society event that sent my parents into an absolute frenzy of social climbing. I watched as my mother paced back and forth across her front lawn, holding a clipboard and gesturing wildly to a landscaping crew she had apparently hired on the spot. She was having them lay down fresh mulch and trim the hedges, trying to make her property look presentable for the new phantom royalty across the street. I pushed the heavy glass window open, letting the warm afternoon breeze filter into my master suite. Because the neighborhood was so quiet, and the houses were relatively close, despite their size, voices carried easily across the asphalt. I stepped out onto my private stone balcony and leaned against the railing, remaining hidden behind a large potted fern. My father, Thomas, came storming out of his front door. His face was flushed a deep mottled red, and his usually immaculate hair was disheveled. He marched down the driveway toward Linda, waving a stack of crumpled papers in his hand. I could hear every word of his frantic, panicked rant. He told my mother that his commercial logistics company was hemorrhaging money faster than he could borrow it. I listened with cold fascination, as the man who had mocked my career admitted that he was on the absolute verge of total bankruptcy. He was begging suppliers for extensions and dodging calls from the bank. "We need this new neighbor, Linda," he hissed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "Whoever bought that estate in cash is swimming in liquid capital. They have the kind of money that could save my business. We have to make a connection. We need an angel investor bailout before the end of the quarter, or we are going to lose this house and everything else." Linda stopped fussing over the mulch and grabbed his arm, nodding vigorously. She assured him they would bake a pie, host a dinner party, and do whatever it took to charm the billionaire. It was a pathetic display of greed and fear. They were planning to beg a stranger for financial salvation, completely oblivious to the fact that their discarded daughter held the deed to the neighborhood. While my parents plotted their desperate financial rescue mission, Brittany was fighting her own battle for career survival. Losing the massive commission on my estate had severely jeopardized her standing at her luxury brokerage. She had practically guaranteed her managing broker that she would secure the listing and the buyer. Now she was staring down the barrel of a ruined reputation. But Brittany was nothing if not dangerously arrogant. She firmly believed she could charm her way into any exclusive circle. From my balcony, I watched her pull her sleek car into my parents' driveway. She stepped out wearing a skin-tight designer dress and towering heels. In her arms, she carried an obscenely extravagant welcome basket, overflowing with imported wines, artisanal cheeses, and what looked like a solid gold paperweight. Tucked neatly under her arm was her thick leather-bound real estate portfolio. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was going to brazenly introduce herself to the anonymous buyer, beg for their future business, and try to salvage her path to a junior partnership. Brittany marched across the street with the heavy basket, her heels clicking loudly against the pavement. She did not even bother to press the intercom button at my front perimeter. Instead, she waited for a delivery driver to exit the property and brazenly pushed her way past the electronic iron gate before it could slide completely shut. She strutted confidently up the long, winding driveway, rehearsing her perfect corporate smile. I turned away from the balcony and walked downstairs to meet her. I grabbed a plastic bag of packing trash from the kitchen and pushed open the massive front door, wearing my faded sweatpants, just as Brittany reached the top step. I stood perfectly still, calmly gazing right at her, while the bright morning sun illuminated the undeniable reality of our completely unavoidable reunion. The long-awaited inevitable collision was finally happening right here, right now. Brittany froze in her tracks, her designer heels catching on the immaculate paving stones of my driveway. The confident smile she had been practicing vanished, replaced by a look of sheer bewilderment. Her eyes darted from my faded sweatpants to the black plastic trash bag dangling from my hand, and then up to my face. I could see the gears grinding in her head as she struggled to comprehend why the sister she violently evicted 7 days ago was strolling out of the most expensive real estate in the zip code. I wondered if she would put the pieces together, realizing she miscalculated my financial standing. But Brittany was blinded by prejudice. To her, I was a failure who fed off the success of others. The narrative in her mind shifted instantly to fit her worldview. The confusion melted away, hardening into a mask of visceral disgust. She let out a sharp scoff that cut through the quiet air. "Oh my God," she said, her voice dripping with venomous amusement. "You actually came back here. I cannot believe you were so desperate after I kicked you out that you came crawling back to beg the new neighbor for a handout." She shifted the massive welcome basket from her right arm to her left, struggling with its weight, and pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "You are working here as the live-in maid, are you not?" she demanded, a cruel laugh bubbling from her throat. "That is absolutely pathetic, Julia. You could not afford a hotel, so you knocked on the door of a billionaire and sobbed until they gave you a mop and a bucket in exchange for a place to sleep. Of course you would end up doing manual labor for the very people I do business with." I remained silent, allowing her malicious words to echo off the stone facade of my estate. I simply looked at her with a blank, pleasant expression, the kind of polite detachment a servant might reserve for a rude delivery person. My silence emboldened her. She took another step forward, her eyes sweeping over the magnificent architecture behind me with undeniable hunger. Well, she continued, her tone brisk and authoritative, at least you are doing honest work instead of sitting on your computer all day. Just stay out of my way. I am here on official business to speak with the owner. Before I could reply, hurried footsteps drew my attention down the driveway. My mother, Linda, was practically jogging across the street, her eyes fixed on the imposing structure of my new home. She had clearly been watching Brittany's approach from her window and could not resist inserting herself into the interaction. As she breached the perimeter of the open electronic gates, she finally tore her gaze away from the soaring roofline and noticed me standing on the top step. Linda stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her chest in exaggerated shock. "Julia," she gasped, her voice carrying horror and embarrassment. "What on earth are you doing here?" Brittany did not miss a beat. She turned to our mother, her face alight with malicious joy. "She is the new maid, Mom. She got herself hired as the housekeeper so she could sleep in the servants' quarters." Linda's eyes widened, and she let out a harsh laugh that sounded remarkably like my sister's. She marched up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Brittany, looking me up and down with a degrading sneer. "Look at you hauling trash," Linda said, her voice tight with disapproval. "I suppose scrubbing toilets is the only honest work you are qualified for." Hearing my mother say those words should have hurt. In a different lifetime, it would have shattered my heart. A mother is supposed to uplift her child to see the best in them, even when the rest of the world does not. But Linda was consumed by appearances, and a daughter hauling garbage out of a wealthy neighbor's house was the ultimate social humiliation. She looked around nervously, terrified someone from her country club might drive by and witness her speaking to the hired help. They were so utterly convinced of my worthlessness that they created an entire fictional reality to explain my presence, ignoring the fact that I was walking out of the main entrance like I owned the place. Rather than correcting them and revealing my identity as the cash buyer who ruined Brittany's career, I consciously chose to lean into the misunderstanding. The opportunity was simply too delicious to pass up. I wanted to see exactly how far they would go. I wanted them to dig their own graves with their own arrogant hands. So I relaxed my shoulders and softened my gaze, playing the role of the subservient maid perfectly. I offered them a polite blank stare completely devoid of my usual fierce independence. Brittany, sensing my submission, seized the opportunity to assert dominance. She straightened her posture, projecting the image of a successful broker. "Listen to me carefully, Julia," she said. "I am not here to chat with domestic staff. I am here to welcome the new owner to the neighborhood today. I have a comprehensive portfolio to present, and I need him to understand the value of keeping his local investments within our brokerage. Go back inside and fetch your boss. Tell him Brittany is here." I tilted my head, maintaining my accommodating expression. "I am afraid the owner is not available right now," I replied. My voice deferential, masking the amusement bubbling beneath the surface. "He is busy settling in." Brittany's face turned crimson. Her patience, dangerously thin after losing her commission, finally snapped. She took a threatening step up the stairs, standing mere inches from my face. "Do not play games with me," she hissed. "You might be fine throwing your life away and scrubbing floors, but my career is important. I have lost enough because of this anonymous buyer. I am not leaving until I speak with the man who bought this house. Fetch the owner immediately. That is an order." Before I could repeat my refusal, Brittany lost what restraint she had left. She shoved the heavy welcome basket into my chest with an aggressive motion. The wicker edge dug into my collarbone as I instinctively caught the gift before it could shatter. The physical hostility was startling. Linda watched with an approving nod, satisfied that Brittany was putting me in my place. "Take the basket," Brittany commanded, her eyes blazing. "Take it inside, put it on the counter, and tell your boss Brittany is waiting. Do not make me ask you again, beggar." I looked down at the massive arrangement resting against my chest, then looked slowly back up into my sister's enraged face. A genuinely pleasant smile spread across my lips, reaching my eyes. "I will be happy to accept this gift on behalf of the boss," I said, my voice smooth and unbothered by her aggression. As I spoke, I casually slipped my right hand into the deep pocket of my sweatpants. My fingers found the small remote control fob. Without breaking eye contact with my furious sister, I silently pressed the red button, instantly activating the estate's hidden security cameras that were recording every second of her trespassing, physical assault, and verbal abuse. Brittany glared at me, clearly expecting me to buckle under her sudden physical aggression. "I told you to go fetch the owner, Julia," she snapped, her voice echoing sharply off the stone portico. "This is a multi-million-dollar property. The man who bought this place will need a local broker, and I am the best in the city. Tell him Brittany is here to offer a consultation." I adjusted my grip on the heavy welcome basket, playing perfectly into her perception of a subservient maid. "I am afraid that is impossible," I replied smoothly. "The owner is out of the country on an extended business trip. He left strict instructions not to be disturbed by uninvited guests or solicitations." The polite refusal hit Brittany like a sharp physical blow. Her face flushed a deep mottled red. She was completely unwilling to accept a barrier between her and her next massive commission, especially a barrier made of the sister she despised. Out of the country, Linda chimed in, grabbing Brittany's arm in a sudden panic. "Brittany, if he is not even here, maybe we should just leave the basket and go. We do not want to cause a scene." Brittany shook off our mother's hand. "We are not going anywhere," she spat. "I am not letting this anonymous buyer slip away. If he is out of the country, I will leave my portfolio inside on the entryway table where he cannot miss it." Before I could block the entrance, Brittany lunged forward. She intentionally drove her shoulder hard into my arm, shoving me out of the way with enough force to make me stumble. She marched over the threshold directly into the grand foyer of my home, her high heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble floor. Linda let out a small gasp, but she immediately followed her golden child inside, completely ignoring the blatant trespassing. I regained my balance and set the welcome basket on the floor. I stepped inside and pulled the heavy mahogany door shut behind us. I remained perfectly silent, watching them take in the absolute opulence of the grand foyer. The space was breathtaking. Twin sweeping staircases framed the massive entryway leading up to a second-floor balcony. A crystal chandelier hung from the 30-foot ceiling, casting warm light across the pristine marble. In the center of the foyer, sitting atop a polished obsidian pedestal, was a priceless centuries-old Ming Dynasty vase. I had purchased the delicate porcelain painted with intricate cobalt blue dragons at a private auction in London. It rested on a magnificent antique Persian rug. Brittany stopped dead. I watched her eyes dart frantically, taking in the absolute wealth that surrounded her. The raw, unfiltered jealousy on her face was difficult to look at. This was the exact kind of wealth she desperately craved, but could never achieve. She was standing in a house she believed she deserved to sell, and the sheer envy was eating her alive. "My God," Linda whispered, spinning in a slow circle. "Brittany, look at this place. The buyer must be worth billions. You absolutely have to secure this account. Your father's logistics company depends on it entirely." I know Mom. Brittany snapped, practically vibrating with desperate energy. She scanned the space for the most prominent surface to display her real estate portfolio. Her eyes locked onto a sleek console table positioned near the base of the left staircase. To reach the table, Brittany cut directly across the center of the room, marching straight over the Persian rug. She was not paying attention to her surroundings, her gaze entirely fixated on her self-promotion. In her blind arrogance, her designer heel caught the thick, raised edge of the antique rug. She stumbled forward, letting out a sharp cry as she flailed her arms to catch her balance. Her heavy leather portfolio slipped from her grasp, but it was the sweeping motion of her right arm that caused the real damage. Her hand collided hard with the obsidian pedestal in the center of the room. The impact sent a sickening shudder through the heavy stone base. The priceless Ming vase wobbled precariously. Time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl as the delicate porcelain tilted past its center of gravity. I did not move a single muscle to stop it. I simply watched it fall. The vase plummeted toward the floor, striking the unforgiving Italian marble. The sound of the impact was catastrophic. A sharp crash echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, followed by the chaotic shattering of ancient porcelain. Hundreds of jagged cobalt blue and white shards exploded outward, scattering across the pristine floor and embedding themselves deep into the crimson threads of the antique rug. The destruction was absolute. Total suffocating silence slammed down upon the grand foyer. Linda let out a strangled scream. She scrambled backward, pressing her back flush against the heavy front door, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She stared at the shattered remains of the priceless artifact, fully comprehending the financial liability that had just occurred. She knew exactly what Brittany had destroyed, and she knew they could never afford to replace it. Brittany froze, her chest heaving as she stared down at the jagged shards. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She knew destroying a billionaire's priceless artifact while trespassing would be the final nail in her professional coffin. But Brittany was a master of survival through deflection. She had spent her entire life blaming me for her mistakes, and this moment would be no different. The terror in her eyes lasted only a brief moment before it hardened into something entirely malicious. She slowly turned her head and locked her gaze on me, her expression twisting into a mask of pure vindictive cruelty. She pointed her manicured finger directly at the center of my chest. "Look what you just did!" Brittany hissed, her voice trembling with manufactured rage. She marched right up to me. "You are completely useless. You bumped into me and caused me to trip. Clean this up immediately, you pathetic beggar." Linda instantly mirrored the accusation. The panic vanished from our mother's face, replaced by a self-righteous sneer. "Honestly, Julia, this is exactly why you can never hold down a respectable job," Linda scolded, shaking her head in disgust. "You are terribly clumsy. You had better pray the owner has insurance, because there is absolutely no way you will ever earn enough scrubbing toilets to pay for whatever that ugly pot cost." I maintained my blank, subservient expression, absorbing their venom without a flinch. "I will handle the mess," I said quietly, keeping my eyes cast downward in a show of complete submission. Brittany scoffed, snatching her leather portfolio from the floor. She marched over to the console table and aggressively slammed her business cards and promotional brochures down onto the polished wood. "You make sure you tell your boss exactly what happened here today," Brittany commanded, adjusting her blazer. "Tell him that his clumsy maid broke his vase because she was too stupid to walk properly. But make sure you let him know that Brittany is highly available for his next major real estate purchase." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my honor against their fabricated lies. I simply offered a polite nod, turning my back on them, to walk toward the utility closet down the hall. I retrieved a dustpan and a broom, walking back into the foyer and dropping to my knees. I began slowly sweeping up the priceless shards of porcelain, letting them look down at me as I performed the menial labor they believed I deserved. Brittany and Linda exchanged a triumphant, self-satisfied look. They had successfully trespassed, caused catastrophic property damage, and shifted the blame entirely onto their designated scapegoat. They turned and walked out the front door, their heads held high, completely convinced of their own victory. The heavy mahogany door swung shut behind them, the lock engaging with a loud final click. I stopped sweeping. I slowly stood up, letting the dustpan drop to the marble floor. The subservient mask instantly vanished from my face. I reached into my sweatpants pocket and pulled out my encrypted phone. I tapped the screen, accessing the estate's central security mainframe. Within seconds, a progress bar appeared on the glowing screen. I stood completely alone in the magnificent silent foyer, watching as the system successfully downloaded the crystal-clear, multi-angle 4K security footage, capturing every single moment of Brittany's illegal trespassing, her catastrophic vandalism, and her vicious verbal abuse. I sent the downloaded video files directly to my lead corporate attorney in Chicago, before the dust from the shattered porcelain had even settled on the marble floor. My specific instructions to him were absolute and entirely devoid of any mercy whatsoever. He was to quickly draft a massive, devastating lawsuit naming both Brittany personally and her entire luxury real estate brokerage firm as the primary defendants in the case. The legal charges were incredibly severe, including illegal trespassing and the catastrophic destruction of a priceless historical artifact. I demanded the legal strike be ruthlessly executed the very next morning, at the exact moment the downtown brokerage officially opened its glass doors for business. I wanted maximum public visibility and absolutely zero time for my sister to secretly construct another one of her convenient protective lies to save herself. The vast legal machinery I commanded moved with ruthless surgical efficiency, immediately ensuring the crushing trap was fully set in motion long before the morning sunrise. The morning sun was bright and unforgiving as Brittany pulled her sleek car into the reserved parking garage of her downtown firm. She strode toward the heavy glass entrance doors, with her usual arrogant confidence holding her expensive designer coffee. She fully expected to start her day by boasting to her colleagues about her aggressive neighborhood networking and the massive commission she was bound to secure. Instead, she found two uniformed building security guards and her managing broker, Richard, blocking the lobby entrance. Richard looked absolutely livid. His face was a tight mask of professional panic and barely contained fury. He did not offer her a polite greeting. He simply held up a thick legal binder and demanded she hand over her building access card immediately. Brittany froze in the middle of the crowded lobby, demanding to know what was going on. Richard did not mince words. He informed her loudly enough for several passing agents to hear that the firm had just been served with a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit by the elite legal team representing the anonymous buyer of the new suburban estate. Brittany tried to laugh it off, immediately falling back on her fabricated story about a clumsy maid dropping a cheap vase. But Richard simply turned his tablet around and pressed play. Brittany watched the color completely drain from her face as the crystal-clear, high-definition footage played on the bright screen. The video captured her violently shoving the welcome basket into the chest of the woman she assumed was a servant. It showed her aggressively forcing her way into the grand foyer and carelessly shattering the Ming vase into hundreds of pieces. There was pristine audio too, capturing her exact malicious words, ordering the maid to clean it up and take the blame. Richard informed her that her real estate license was suspended effectively immediately, pending a full police investigation into the trespassing and property damage. The firm was publicly severing all professional ties with her to protect their own reputation from the catastrophic financial liability she had just incurred. Before Brittany could even process the magnitude of the disaster, the security guards flanked her sides and unceremoniously escorted her out of the building. She was left standing on the busy city sidewalk holding a small cardboard box of her desk belongings, completely stripped of her career and her dignity. Less than an hour later, Brittany burst through the front door of my parents' house in a state of absolute hysteria. Thomas and Linda were sitting at the kitchen island, deeply engrossed in a discussion about their mounting financial woes, when their golden child collapsed into a dining chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Through her panicked, ragged gasps, she explained that the brokerage firm had fired her on the spot. She revealed that she was personally named in a massive lawsuit for the destruction of a vase that cost significantly more than their entire retirement portfolio combined. The devastating news hit Thomas like a physical blow to the chest. The color vanished from his cheeks as he gripped the edge of the granite countertop to steady himself. His failing commercial logistics business was entirely dependent on the fragile illusion of their family wealth. He had been secretly relying on Brittany securing a massive luxury commission just to help cover their upcoming mortgage payment and keep his aggressive creditors at bay. Now, instead of acting as a financial savior, his daughter had just dragged a multi-million-dollar liability right onto their doorstep. If the lawsuit moved forward, it would not just bankrupt Brittany, it would completely obliterate their carefully maintained social standing and force the entire family into immediate and irreversible financial ruin. Linda began pacing the kitchen floor, her mind racing as she desperately tried to comprehend how their perfect plan had disintegrated so quickly. She had witnessed the destruction firsthand, but she still genuinely believed the absurd lie they had constructed the day before. In her mind, I was still the pathetic, subservient maid who lived across the street. The blind panic in the kitchen slowly morphed into a dark, desperate kind of anger. They needed a way out of this monumental disaster, and they needed it fast. Thomas slammed his fist down on the island. He declared that they were not going to let a clumsy servant ruin their entire family. He reasoned that the billionaire owner was currently out of the country and had only seen the security footage sent by his lawyers. If they could get to the maid and force her to sign a sworn statement claiming she had invited Brittany inside and accidentally tripped her, they could shift the blame entirely and invalidate the lawsuit. It was an absurdly flawed legal strategy born of pure desperation, but Linda and Brittany eagerly latched onto it. They knew exactly where to find me. Before my sudden and violent eviction, I had spent every single morning working remotely from a quiet, independent coffee shop located just a few blocks away from their pristine neighborhood. Linda remembered my daily routine perfectly. She told Thomas they needed to go there immediately, confront me in public, and intimidate me into taking the fall for the broken vase. They were completely convinced I was weak enough to fold under their combined pressure. The short drive over to the cafe took them barely 5 minutes of tense silence. I was sitting at my usual corner table in the coffee shop, nursing a warm mug of green tea. The steam curled upward as my laptop sat open, displaying the real-time security feeds from my new estate. The morning rush had finally faded, leaving the shop relatively quiet and smelling faintly of roasted espresso beans. I heard the unmistakable chime of the front door opening, followed by the heavy, aggressive footsteps of my family marching across the polished wooden floor. Thomas, Linda, and Brittany moved together in a tight, furious pack, scanning the room until their eyes immediately locked onto me. They stormed over to my table with a disturbing intensity, their faces twisted with desperate rage, completely unaware that they were stepping perfectly into the very center of my inescapable trap. The heavy metal bell above the cafe door had barely finished ringing before my father slammed both of his hands down flat against my small wooden table. The sudden, violent sound echoed sharply through the quiet coffee shop, causing several patrons nearby to jump in their seats and turn their heads in our direction. I did not flinch. I slowly moved my mug of green tea safely out of the splash zone and looked up into Thomas's face. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive golf shirt, and his eyes were dark with a frantic, cornered kind of panic. Linda flanked his right side, gripping her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Brittany stood just behind them, shifting her weight nervously from side to side, looking everywhere except directly at me. They had brought the entire family unit to ambush me in public, assuming the sheer force of their collective presence would crush me into immediate submission, just like it always had when I was a helpless teenager living under their roof. Thomas did not even bother offering a greeting. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper, and aggressively slapped it down right on top of my laptop keyboard. I calmly picked up the document and unfolded it, resting it on the table between my tea and my computer. It was an already drafted legal affidavit. I scanned the typed paragraphs quickly, my eyes easily digesting the dense legal jargon. It was a formal confession of guilt. The document explicitly stated that I was an employee of the estate across the street, serving in the capacity of a domestic housekeeper. It detailed a completely fabricated sequence of events, where I had carelessly invited my sister inside without authorization, negligently tripped her in the grand foyer, and personally caused the catastrophic destruction of a highly valuable antique vase. "Sign it!" My father commanded, his voice a harsh, low rumble that carried across the surrounding tables. He pulled a silver pen from his heavy jacket pocket and tossed it onto the paper. It landed with a sharp, heavy clatter. "You are going to sign that confession right now, Julia, and you are going to take full legal responsibility for everything that happened in that house this morning. You are going to state for the official record that you were acting as a negligent employee and that Brittany was simply a victim of your careless domestic incompetence." I looked directly from the absurd document to my father's red, flushed face. The sheer audacity of his absolute demand was staggering. They had just committed a massive felony inside my home, and their immediate solution was to track me down and force me to legally absorb their financial ruin. I did not reach for the silver pen. I simply let my two hands rest comfortably in my lap, leaning back slightly in my wooden chair. Linda pushed her way forward, leaning over the table to intrude on my personal space. She lowered her voice, attempting to inject a tone of maternal reasoning into the deeply hostile interaction. "Julia, be sensible about this," she urged, her eyes wide with desperate manipulation. "You need to look at the bigger picture. Your sister has a real future. She is on the verge of becoming a junior partner at a highly respected firm. You have nothing to lose. You are just scrubbing floors and hauling garbage. A property damage claim will not ruin a maid's career, but it will completely destroy Brittany. We are your family. You owe us for raising you. We put a roof over your head and food in your stomach for years, and this is the least you can do to repay that debt." I stared at my mother, letting her toxic words hang in the air between us. She genuinely believed that my entire existence was so utterly devoid of value that I should willingly accept an enormous financial liability just to shield her favorite daughter from the consequences of her own reckless, destructive arrogance. They viewed me as nothing more than a convenient human shield, a sacrificial lamb they could throw to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "I am not taking the blame for your daughter's vandalism." The air around our table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Linda gasped, pulling back as if I had physically struck her. Brittany let out a whimper of sheer panic, shrinking behind our mother's shoulder. But it was Thomas who reacted with the most volatile aggression. The thin veneer of civility he had been attempting to maintain shattered instantly. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He leaned his entire body weight over the small cafe table, pressing his face so close to mine, I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You listen to me, you worthless little parasite," he snarled, his voice dropping to a vicious, deadly whisper. "You do not get to say no to me. If you do not pick up that pen and sign that confession right this second, I will walk outside and call the police. I will tell the authorities that you stole my sedan the night you left my house. I will report that you broke into my safe and stole thousands of dollars worth of irreplaceable family heirlooms before you ran off. You have no money, no power, and no standing in this community. It will be the word of a respected business owner against a vagrant domestic servant. We will bury you in a jail cell, you ungrateful failure." He glared down at me, fully expecting to see terror flood my eyes. He expected me to shatter under the weight of his dark, terrifying threat, to reach for the pen with trembling hands and sign my life away just to escape his wrath. He had spent his entire life ruling our household with that exact same brand of psychological warfare, and he was absolutely certain it would work again today. Instead, I felt a genuine warm smile spread across my face. The absolute absurdity of his threats, combined with the perfect irony of the situation, was simply too much to ignore. I looked up at Thomas, Linda, and Brittany, taking in their desperate, angry faces. A soft, low laugh escaped my lips, echoing quietly over the gentle hum of the busy coffee shop. I reached forward and slowly picked up the heavy silver pen, rolling it thoughtfully between my fingers for a long, silent moment before setting it carefully back down on the wooden table. Then I picked up the neatly typed legal confession. I held it up between both of my hands, and with slow, deliberate precision, I tore the thick paper directly down the middle. I stacked the two halves together and tore them again, letting the shredded pieces flutter down onto the wooden tabletop. "I cannot sign a confession as an employee," I whispered coldly, leaning slightly forward. "Because I am the owner of that house." The absolute absurdity of my statement hung in the warm air of the cafe. Thomas stared at me with his mouth slightly open, his aggressive posture freezing into pure bewilderment. Linda blinked rapidly, her eyes darting between the shredded confession and my calm face. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the silence at our table was deafening. Then a sudden harsh sound erupted from my father's throat. It was a cruel, booming laugh that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the coffee shop. Linda quickly joined in, her tension dissolving into a shrill, mocking cackle. Brittany let out a breath she had been holding and smiled in utter disbelief. They honestly thought I had lost my mind. Thomas slammed his hand down on the table again, tears of mirth forming in his eyes. He leaned back and looked at me as if I were a pathetic broken animal. He told me my fantasy world was the saddest thing he had ever witnessed. He genuinely believed that the crushing weight of my poverty had finally driven me to clinical insanity. Linda wiped her eyes and told me I needed psychiatric help if I actually thought anyone would believe a maid owned a $50 million estate. My mother patted my cheek with condescending pity, telling me my delusions would not save me from a jail cell. Thomas stopped laughing and straightened his jacket, his expression hardening back into ruthless malice. He promised he would call the police the second he returned to his office personally, making sure I was arrested for grand larceny before the sun went down. Without waiting for a response, the three of them turned in unison and marched out of the coffee shop, leaving me sitting in total peace as the shredded pieces of their confession rested uselessly on the table. The rest of the day proved to be an absolute nightmare for my sister. By mid-afternoon, the reality of the lawsuit had fully paralyzed her world. Her bank accounts were temporarily frozen as the discovery process initiated, and her phone rang endlessly with calls from panicked colleagues who wanted nothing to do with her toxic reputation. The immense financial pressure about to collapse onto our parents was now resting on her shoulders. Brittany sat in the passenger seat of her car, in a random parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. The terrifying reality of her shattered career was suffocating her, but instead of accepting accountability for her catastrophic vandalism, her mind violently shifted the blame entirely onto me. In her twisted perception of reality, I was the sole reason her life was falling apart. If I had just signed the paper, if I had taken the fall like a good scapegoat, she would be safe. The fact that I had refused and laughed in their faces while claiming to own the mansion sent her into a blinding, destructive rage. She needed to hurt me. She needed to completely obliterate whatever pathetic life I had built for myself. She knew exactly where I lived, or at least where she thought I lived. For years, I had occupied a tiny apartment in the industrial sector of downtown, a place my family had visited once before, declaring it a disgusting slum. Brittany knew I relied on my computer equipment for my freelance work. She decided that if her career was going to be destroyed, mine was going to be physically smashed to pieces. Late that night, long after the city streets had emptied, Brittany drove her expensive car into the gritty, poorly lit industrial district. The streetlights flickered overhead as she parked a block away from my old apartment building. She reached into the back seat and grabbed a heavy aluminum baseball bat she had purchased earlier that evening from a sporting goods store. Her heart pounded with thrilling adrenaline as she slipped out of the car and hurried down the cracked sidewalk. The night air was humid, but she hardly noticed the discomfort. She marched through the rusted front gate and slipped inside the main lobby, avoiding the sleepy security guard at the front desk. She took the stairs, her designer boots clicking quietly against the concrete steps as she climbed to the fourth floor. The hallway was dimly lit and smelled faintly of old paint and damp carpets. She found my door at the end of the hall, the familiar faded number plate hanging slightly crooked. Brittany had always possessed a malicious talent for getting into places she did not belong. She pulled a tension wrench and a small lockpick from her jacket pocket tools she had confiscated from an old boyfriend years ago and learned to use for her own amusement. Her hands trembled with nervous, destructive anticipation as she slid the metal picks into the old deadbolt. She expected the flimsy apartment lock to pop open with a simple twist. Instead, she encountered heavy, complex resistance. It took her nearly 5 minutes of frustrated, sweaty maneuvering before she finally felt the heavy internal tumblers click into place. She grabbed the door handle, took a deep breath, and shoved her way inside, tightly gripping the aluminum bat with both hands, completely prepared to smash every monitor, laptop, and piece of cheap furniture she could find. Brittany charged aggressively over the threshold, raising the baseball bat high above her shoulder, and then she stopped absolutely dead in her tracks. Her jaw dropped open, and the heavy aluminum bat slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the floor with a loud ringing metallic clang. She was not standing in a cramped, pathetic living room. There was no cheap sofa, no tiny kitchenette, and no personal belongings whatsoever. Instead, she found herself standing in a freezing cold, massive, cavernous space that looked like it belonged inside a military compound. The walls had been completely stripped and reinforced with thick steel paneling. Row upon row of massive, towering black server racks stretched across the length of the entire apartment, humming with a deep, vibrating electrical power that rattled her teeth. Thousands of small green and blue LED lights blinked rapidly in the dark, illuminating miles of thick, organized cables running along the ceiling. The air conditioning was intense, blasting frigid air to keep the massive processors from overheating. She was standing inside a high-tech federal-grade server room, the central nervous system for my global software company. As Brittany took a trembling step backward, her brain desperately trying to comprehend the impossible wealth and technology surrounding her, her forced entry instantly tripped a silent Homeland Security level perimeter alarm. A series of bright, rotating red lights suddenly flared to life along the steel ceiling, bathing the humming server racks in a harsh, pulsating crimson glow. Before she could even turn around to run, a heavy secondary, reinforced steel door dropped from the top of the doorframe with a terrifying mechanical slam. The deadbolts engaged automatically with a series of loud, heavy metallic thuds, locking firmly from the outside. Brittany rushed forward and slammed her hands against the cold steel door, screaming for help as the reality of her situation set in. She was entirely trapped inside. For several frozen seconds, Brittany stood alone inside the sealed server room, finally understanding that this was not a cheap apartment she could vandalize and walk away from. Every blinking light, every humming machine, and every steel wall around her belonged to something far larger than the pathetic version of Julia she had invented in her head. She had not broken into her sister's failure. She had broken into the hidden heart of her sister's empire. The blaring alarms pierced through the thick steel walls of the server room, echoing out into the empty industrial streets. Brittany pounded her fists against the unforgiving metal door until her skin was raw and bruised. She screamed for someone to help her, but her voice was completely swallowed by the deafening mechanical roar of the cooling units and the relentless shrieking of the security sirens. Less than 4 minutes after the perimeter was breached, the heavy screech of tires echoed from the dark alleyway outside. Armed tactical police units swarmed the building. They moved with extreme military precision, responding to a high-priority federal-grade security alert. Flashlights cut through the darkness of the hallway outside as heavy boots pounded up the concrete stairwell. Brittany backed away from the locked door, trembling violently as she heard deep, authoritative voices shouting tactical commands. The electronic locking mechanism on the heavy steel door suddenly disengaged with a loud, sharp click. The heavy door swung open and blinding tactical lights hit her directly in the face. Multiple armed officers rushed into the freezing server room, screaming for her to drop to the ground and put her hands behind her head. Brittany collapsed onto the freezing floor, sobbing hysterically. She tried to babble her usual pathetic excuses, trying to claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding and that she was just looking for her sister. The officers ignored her entirely. They saw the illegal lock-picking tools scattered on the floor next to the dropped aluminum baseball bat. They roughly pulled her arms behind her back, and the cold metal handcuffs snapped tightly shut around her wrists. As they dragged her upright and marched her out of the facility, an officer formally read her rights, informing her she was under arrest for felony corporate espionage and felony breaking and entering. Brittany sobbed so hard she could barely breathe as she was shoved into the back of a waiting police squad car, her designer boots dragging helplessly across the wet pavement. The freezing municipal holding cell reeked of strong bleach and stale sweat. Brittany sat entirely alone, huddled on the rigid metal bench, wrapping her arms tightly around her trembling knees. The bright overhead fluorescent lights buzzed constantly, refusing to let her find even a single moment of peace in the dark. She had never experienced true world consequences before in her entire sheltered, privileged life, and the stark, terrifying physical reality of the bare, heavily reinforced concrete walls was rapidly breaking her incredibly fragile ego and her arrogant mind completely into jagged, unfixable little pieces as the terrifying hours slowly crawled by in total, agonizing isolation. The jarring ring of the telephone woke Thomas just before 3 in the morning. When he heard the serious voice of the desk sergeant at the downtown precinct, the remaining color drained completely from his face. He dressed in a blind panic and raced down to the station with Linda crying silently in the passenger seat. When they arrived, the reality of the charges hit Thomas like a massive freight train. The magistrate had set an absolutely exorbitant bail amount, citing the extreme severity of attempting to sabotage a highly secured corporate data facility. Thomas begged and pleaded with the desk sergeant, trying to use his status as a local business owner to leverage an early release. But his arrogant demands fell on deaf ears. They demanded hard cash. Thomas sat in his idling car outside the precinct, his hands gripping the steering wheel as a suffocating wave of total panic washed over him. He pulled out his laptop and logged into his logistics business primary operational accounts. His business was already hemorrhaging money and drowning in deep debt. The numbers staring back at him in the harsh glow of the screen represented his very last financial lifeline. They were the funds needed to pay his remaining drivers and keep his leased delivery trucks on the road for the next month. With a trembling finger, he initiated a massive wire transfer, entirely draining his business operational funds to cover the exorbitant bail bond. He sacrificed his entire business just to keep his golden child out of a federal holding cell. When Brittany was finally released into their custody, just as the sun began to rise over the city, she looked like a completely broken shell of a human being. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled and stained, her mascara was smeared heavily down her cheeks, and she shook uncontrollably. The agonizing ride back to their pristine suburban neighborhood was consumed by a suffocating, oppressive silence. Once they were safely locked inside their kitchen, the true horror of their financial decimation finally settled over the family. Thomas paced the hardwood floor, running his hands through his thinning hair as he explained exactly what he had just done to secure her release. He bluntly informed his wife and daughter that the logistics firm was now facing immediate and unavoidable default. They were completely out of cash. They had absolutely no way to pay her upcoming mountain of legal defense fees. They could not even cover the basic operating expenses required to keep their own house. The massive lawsuit from the morning before was still hanging over their heads like a guillotine, and now they had added severe felony criminal charges to the rapidly expanding inferno of their ruined lives. Linda collapsed into a dining chair, weeping openly as the carefully constructed illusion of their wealth officially shattered into a million unfixable pieces. They desperately needed a financial miracle, and they needed it before the banks opened on Monday morning. Thomas retreated into his home office and securely locked the door. He spent the next 12 hours frantically working the phones, calling every single business contact, associate, and old friend he had ever known. He was begging for temporary loans, asking for extensions, and seeking any possible avenue for a quick infusion of capital. Everyone firmly turned him down. Word of the imminent instability was already spreading rapidly through the local business community. In a final act of sheer desperation, Thomas reached out to a retired city councilman he had done a massive undocumented favor for over 2 decades ago. He cashed in his absolute last remaining chip, demanding a huge favor in return. He needed access to massive emergency funding immediately. The old politician told him about a highly exclusive private event happening that very weekend. It was the annual Commerce Gala, an elite gathering of the wealthiest venture capitalists and corporate titans in the entire state. More importantly, the councilman revealed a very specific rumor currently circulating through the financial underground. A mysterious anonymous angel investor who had been aggressively buying up local tech debt and injecting millions in emergency capital into failing businesses was confirmed to be attending the gala in person. Thomas managed to secure exactly 3 tickets to the event, using the absolute last ounce of leverage he possessed in the world. He walked back into the kitchen where Linda and Brittany were still sitting in stunned, miserable silence. He slammed the 3 printed tickets down onto the expensive granite island. He looked at his wife and his golden child with a cold, ruthless intensity they had never ever seen before. He demanded they dry their tears and put on their very best fake smiles. They were going to the gala, and they were going to track down this anonymous investor to beg for their financial lives. By Saturday evening, desperation had dressed itself in formal wear. Thomas forced himself into his best tuxedo. Linda covered her swollen eyes with layers of makeup, and Brittany wore a designer gown that could not hide the panic shaking beneath her skin. They entered the annual Commerce Gala, pretending they still belonged among the city's elite, but every smile was strained, and every step was fueled by fear. Thomas scanned the ballroom like a starving man searching for food, looking for any sign of the mysterious angel investor who could save his collapsing company. Then Brittany saw Julia near the center of the room, calm, elegant, and impossibly composed in a custom silk gown. For one stunned second, the family simply stared. Then Brittany's humiliation twisted into rage. The heat rising in Brittany's face blinded her to the hundreds of powerful people mingling around her. In her fractured, desperate mind, there was only one logical explanation for her sister's presence at the most exclusive financial event of the decade. Julia had somehow maxed out a credit card to rent a designer gown, snuck past the vigilant door staff, and tracked them down just to beg for scraps from the catering tables and publicly embarrass them. The sheer audacity of it after everything that had happened over the last 24 hours snapped the very last thread of Brittany's self-control. She stomped across the pristine marble floor of the ballroom, her heels striking the stone with violent, aggressive force. A broad-shouldered security guard in a dark suit was standing near the edge of the crowd, observing the room with quiet professionalism. Brittany lunged toward him and grabbed his forearm, her manicured fingers digging sharply into his expensive jacket. She yanked him in Julia's direction, her voice tearing through the refined atmosphere like a jagged piece of glass. She pointed a trembling finger directly at her sister and shrieked that she was a maid. She screamed that Julia was a desperate criminal who had snuck into the building demanding that the guard kick her out before she stole something from the guests. Her shrill, hysterical voice echoed off the magnificent vaulted ceilings, slicing through the polite chatter of the room. The subtle, elegant jazz music flowing from the live orchestra immediately faltered and died out as the musicians lowered their instruments in shock. Hundreds of the city's wealthiest and most powerful figures turned their heads in unison, their champagne glasses frozen in mid-air as they watched the horrifying spectacle unfold. Thomas and Linda, who had been desperately trying to corner a wealthy local bank manager near the towering ice sculpture, heard the commotion and spun around. When they saw Julia standing there, dripping in quiet luxury, while their eldest daughter screamed like a lunatic, utter panic seized their chests. Their entire financial future depended on projecting an image of total stability and grace tonight. They could not afford to be associated with a trashy, unhinged public scene. Thomas shoved his way through the circle of wealthy onlookers, dragging Linda by the wrist. They rushed over and flanked Brittany, instantly forming a hostile, unified front against the woman they still believed was nothing but a pathetic failure. Thomas puffed out his chest, his face red with exertion and overwhelming stress as he glared at the security guard. He raised his voice desperately, trying to sound like a man of immense authority and means. He demanded that Julia be physically thrown out into the street immediately. He claimed she was a mentally unstable estranged relative who was stalking them, and that removing her was strictly necessary to protect the integrity of the event. Linda stepped forward, her fake pearls clicking against her collarbone, and added her own venom to the fire. She loudly proclaimed that Julia was a common house cleaner who had absolutely no business breathing the same air as the esteemed investors in this room. They stood there, a trio of desperate, furious people waiting for the guard to aggressively tackle Julia and drag her out of the ballroom so they could salvage their night. The security guard did not move a single muscle toward Julia. He did not reach for his radio, and he did not step forward to detain her. Instead, he gently but firmly pried Brittany's clawing hands off his jacket and took a very deliberate step back, looking directly at Julia, as if waiting for her permission to act. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sound of deliberate echoing footsteps approaching from the front of the ballroom. The mayor of the city, the man personally hosting this elite commerce gala, was stepping down from the raised velvet podium. He had been preparing to give the opening address, but the disruption had caught his full attention. He walked through the crowd, his expression completely unreadable, as the wealthy attendees respectfully parted to let him through. Thomas saw the mayor approaching and felt a sudden massive surge of misplaced relief. He genuinely believed the most powerful politician in the city was coming over to personally handle this embarrassing security breach and apologize to his family for the disturbance. Thomas plastered on his most charming, practiced smile and took a step forward, extending his hand to greet the man. He opened his mouth fully prepared to offer a smooth, sophisticated apology for his deranged daughter ruining the start of the gala. He wanted to assure the mayor that his family was composed of upstanding citizens who simply wanted to enjoy the evening without being harassed by a low-class interloper. The mayor completely ignored Thomas's outstretched hand. He did not even look at him. He walked straight past Thomas, his eyes fixed entirely on Brittany. The politician stopped just a few feet away from her, his face hardening into a look of absolute icy disgust. He glared at Brittany with such intense withering authority that she physically shrank back, the hysterical breath catching in her throat. The mayor turned to the security guard who was still standing nearby. In a voice that was low, calm, and terrifyingly clear, he ordered the guard to back the family away immediately. He stated that if they raised their voices one more time, they would be the ones escorted out of the building and permanently banned from every municipal event in the district. The security guard instantly stepped forward, using his broad shoulders to physically push Thomas, Linda, and Brittany several feet backward, separating them from Julia. The family was left entirely paralyzed with confusion. Their brains completely short-circuited, unable to process the impossible reality unfolding in front of their eyes. They stood there frozen in shock, their mouths hanging slightly open as they tried to comprehend why the mayor was defending a common maid. Their carefully constructed worldview was cracking, but their arrogance still blinded them to the truth. The mayor then turned his back on the family, completely dismissing their existence. His harsh, authoritative demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of deep, genuine warmth and profound respect. He took a step toward Julia, his eyes reflecting a level of admiration that Thomas had never received in his entire lifetime of desperate social climbing. The mayor smiled a real, authentic smile and respectfully extended his arm toward her. He softly told Julia that it was an absolute honor to finally have her here, apologizing sincerely for the unpleasant greeting she had just endured. He offered to personally escort her to her designated table at the very front of the room, loudly stating that the entire gala had been waiting in eager anticipation for her arrival. Thomas felt all the blood rush out of his head, a cold, dizzying numbness spreading down his spine as he watched the most powerful man in the city treat his youngest daughter like royalty. Linda gripped Thomas's arm, her fingernails digging painfully through his suit jacket as she stared at the scene in absolute terrified bewilderment. Brittany just stood there, her face pale and slack, her mind violently rejecting the information her eyes were feeding her. They watched in shattered silence as Julia accepted the mayor's arm with effortless, quiet grace, leaving them standing alone and utterly humiliated. The mayor guided Julia toward the front of the room, their path clearing naturally as the city's most influential figures stepped aside with expressions of profound respect. Thomas, Linda, and Brittany remained rooted to the marble floor, completely immobilized by the sheer impossibility of the scene unfolding before them. The security guard took a firm stance in front of the family, his shoulders a silent barrier preventing any further outbursts. Brittany tried to open her mouth to utter another accusation, but her throat refused to work. The air had been sucked out of her lungs. She could only stare in mute, uncomprehending horror as her older sister, the woman she had mercilessly tormented and dismissed as a lowly house cleaner, moved through the sea of billionaires and venture capitalists as if she owned the entire building. Linda leaned heavily against Thomas, her legs feeling like lead. She watched the way the wealthy attendees nodded and murmured polite greetings to Julia, their eyes filled with admiration, rather than the pity she had always expected her eldest daughter to evoke. A cold bead of sweat rolled down Thomas's neck. His mind raced frantically, desperately trying to find some logical loophole to explain why the mayor was treating his supposedly impoverished daughter like visiting royalty. There had to be a mistake. It had to be a colossal misunderstanding. The mayor reached the stage and gracefully helped Julia up the carpeted stairs. He stepped to the polished glass podium and adjusted the microphone. A soft chime echoed through the sound system, signaling for attention. The low hum of conversation faded until the room was blanketed in an anticipatory silence. Hundreds of faces turned toward the stage, their attention fixed entirely on the mayor and the stunning woman standing poised beside him. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry and scratchy. He squeezed Linda's arm instinctively, dread pooling heavily in his stomach. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor announced, his deep voice booming clearly through the ballroom speakers. "Please excuse the unfortunate interruption at the entrance. Tonight is a celebration of innovation, resilience, and the bright future of our great city." He paused, casting a brief, withering glance toward the back of the room, where the family stood shivering under the security guard's watchful eye, before turning back to his audience with a warm, expansive smile. "It is my profound honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. For the past 3 years, this remarkable individual has operated quietly behind the scenes, pouring unprecedented resources into our local infrastructure and breathing new life into our struggling commercial sectors." Brittany dug her nails into her own palms, shaking her head in slow, desperate denial. The words the mayor was speaking made absolutely no sense. He had to be talking about someone else. He had to be introducing a different woman. She is not only the largest philanthropic donor in our city's history, having single-handedly funded the new downtown medical annex and the youth technology center. The mayor continued, his voice swelling with genuine pride. She is also the brilliant architect and chief executive officer of the $100 million tech firm that is actively revolutionizing our digital economy. The mayor turned and extended an open, welcoming hand toward Julia. "Please join me in welcoming a true visionary and our most generous anonymous benefactor." The entire ballroom erupted in thunderous, deafening applause. The sound crashed over the family like a physical wave, heavy and suffocating. Wealthy investors, prominent politicians, and powerful corporate executives rose to their feet, delivering a passionate standing ovation. Julia stepped up to the podium, offering a gracious, understated smile to the cheering crowd. She looked completely in her element, exuding a quiet, untouchable power that commanded absolute respect from every single person in the room, except for the 3 people standing frozen by the entrance. Total suffocating silence fell over Thomas, Linda, and Brittany. They did not hear the applause. They did not hear the cheering. The sound was entirely drowned out by the roaring blood rushing through their own ears. As Julia reached the microphone, the stage lighting dimmed slightly, and the massive high-definition digital screens spanning the wall behind her suddenly illuminated. A brilliant, towering corporate logo materialized on the screens, glowing with crisp, undeniable authority. It was a sleek, modern, geometric design, instantly recognizable to anyone involved in the city's financial sector. Beneath the emblem, the company's name was displayed in bold, commanding silver lettering. The blood drained instantly and completely from Thomas's face. His jaw went slack and his eyes widened in stark, absolute terror. He stared at the glowing corporate logo on the massive screen, his brain misfiring as the horrific reality slammed into him with the force of a wrecking ball. He knew that logo. He knew that company name. He had spent the last 90 days staring at it on his computer screen in the dark, desperate hours of the night. Linda felt her husband sway beside her. She looked up at his face and saw a shade of gray she had never witnessed before. His skin was the color of wet ash. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling with rising panic. "Thomas, what is it? What does that mean?" He could not answer her. His mouth opened and closed silently, mimicking a fish suffocating on dry land. The company name glowing brightly behind his estranged daughter was the exact same corporate entity that had been aggressively buying up local commercial debt. It was the parent company of the private equity firm that owned the shattered remains of his logistics business. It was the sole organization holding the mortgage to his pristine suburban house. Brittany stared at the screen, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The realization was slowly penetrating her thick layer of denial. The sister she had mocked, the sister she had tried to frame for corporate vandalism, the sister she had just publicly accused of being a desperate thief, was the chief executive officer of a $100 million tech firm that is actively revolutionizing our digital economy. The massive server room she had broken into with a baseball bat had not been a delusion. It had been the physical heart of Julia's immense wealth. Brittany realized with sickening clarity that the police had not arrested her for smashing a cheap apartment. They had arrested her for attacking a highly secure federal-grade corporate facility owned by the most powerful woman in the room. The felony charges hanging over her head were not going to disappear. They were going to completely destroy her. The horrific, catastrophic realization fully set in, paralyzing his heart. The anonymous angel investor he had been emailing for a bailout for the last 3 months, laying bare his company's pathetic financials and begging for mercy, was his own daughter. He had voluntarily sent dozens of groveling, utterly pathetic messages directly to her private server detailing every single one of his miserable failures. He had literally handed the very person he hated most a complete blueprint to his absolute and total financial ruin. He could not breathe. The glittering walls felt like they were crushing his ribs. His lungs burned as he tried to pull in oxygen. His knees buckled under the unbearable weight of his monumental stupidity. He had come to this elite gala to beg a mysterious savior for his life, only to discover that the savior was the very woman he had spent his entire life trying to destroy. Julia stepped up to the microphone, radiating a calm, absolute authority that captivated the massive ballroom instantly. She spoke eloquently about the future of the city's digital infrastructure, her voice ringing clear and steady over the state-of-the-art sound system. She outlined a brilliant, comprehensive vision for urban revitalization that had veteran venture capitalists nodding in respect. Standing near the rear entrance, Thomas felt his stomach violently twist into a sick knot as he listened to his daughter effortlessly command a room full of billionaires. He watched the way the crowd hung on her every word, mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of her intellect and presence. The way she articulated complex financial strategies proved beyond a doubt she was not just a figurehead, but a true mastermind. When she finally concluded her address with a graceful nod, the response from the room was instantaneous. The audience erupted into a deafening wave of roaring applause. People rose to their feet, once again cheering and whistling for the young woman who had just guaranteed the economic future of their district. Julia stepped down from the glowing stage, flanked by the mayor and several high-ranking city officials who were visibly eager to shake her hand. She moved gracefully through the adoring crowd, accepting compliments with perfect poise. She navigated the elite social circles, as if she had been born into them, effortlessly exchanging pleasantries with industry titans who would never have given Thomas a second glance. From the shadowy periphery, Thomas watched her remarkable trajectory. A frantic surge of desperate adrenaline flooded his veins. He looked at Linda and Brittany, his eyes wide with a chaotic mixture of disbelief and greedy opportunism. He sharply ordered them to wipe the shocked expressions off their faces and follow him immediately. The 3 of them shoved their way aggressively through the dense crowd of wealthy attendees, ignoring the annoyed glares of the influential people they bumped into. They tracked Julia like desperate predators, their eyes fixed on the immense wealth she represented. They followed her as she made her way toward the dimly lit entrance of the private VIP lounge. She excused herself from a group of banking executives and was about to step through the velvet ropes when Thomas caught up to her. He moved quickly, stepping directly into her path and physically blocking her from entering. The rapid transformation in his demeanor was so sudden it was nauseating to witness. The cold, ruthless malice that had defined his entire relationship with her completely vanished, instantly replaced by a wide, frantic plastic smile that stretched unnaturally across his face. Thomas stepped forward and aggressively threw his arms wide open, attempting to pull Julia into a tight, affectionate hug. Julia did not flinch. She simply took one very deliberate step backward, keeping her posture perfectly straight, forcing his arms to drop awkwardly back to his sides. Undeterred by her physical rejection, Thomas let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded incredibly hollow and desperate in the quiet corridor. He clasped his hands together and told her that they knew she had it in her all along. He claimed with a sickeningly sweet tone that everything they had done in the past, all the harsh words, the vicious insults, and the total lack of financial support, was entirely intentional. He had the audacity to stand there and stammer that they were just giving her tough love to make her strong. He told her they had to push her away so she could learn to fly on her own, and they were overwhelmingly proud of the magnificent woman she had become. Linda immediately squeezed past Thomas to join the repulsive performance. She reached up and dramatically wiped away a series of completely fake tears from the corners of her eyes, sniffing loudly to emphasize her manufactured maternal emotion. She reached out and tried to grasp Julia's hand, but Julia smoothly shifted her designer clutch, entirely avoiding the physical contact. Linda let out a breathy, trembling sigh and told Julia that a mother always knows. She claimed she had always known Julia was the special one, the exceptional child destined for true monumental greatness. She insisted that she had spent years quietly praying for this exact moment, watching from afar as her brilliant daughter conquered the corporate world. She spun a ridiculous narrative about how she had secretly protected Julia from the shadows, ensuring that her brilliant mind was never stifled by ordinary expectations. The absolute hypocrisy of her words hung in the air, a foul stench that completely contradicted decades of relentless psychological abuse and cruel calculated neglect. Julia just stood there, her expression perfectly stoic, her eyes cold and unreadable, as she let them dig their own graves with their pathetic, groveling lies. Seeing that her parents were not getting the immediate tearful reunion they had anticipated, Brittany shoved her way to the front of the group. She was shaking violently, the terrifying reality of her impending federal prison sentence hanging over her head like a sharpened blade. She looked at Julia's custom $15,000 silk gown, and her sheer desperation peaked into pure, unadulterated panic. Brittany clasped her hands together in front of her chest, her voice pitching into a shrill, begging whine that echoed pathetically in the hallway. She told Julia that they absolutely needed to forget about the silly little misunderstanding at the server room last night. She fabricated a narrative claiming she was just deeply worried about her big sister and had gone to the facility to make sure she was safe. Without taking a single breath, Brittany completely shifted gears and begged for a high-paying executive job at Julia's tech firm. She rambled frantically, promising that she would be an amazing asset to the company, that she knew exactly how to handle public relations, and that Julia fundamentally needed someone she could actually trust in her inner corporate circle. She leaned in close, claiming, "Blood is thicker than water, and family always protects family." Thomas, acutely realizing that his logistics company was hours away from total operational default, stepped in front of his rambling daughter. He could not waste this golden opportunity letting Brittany beg for a job when his empire was burning to the ground. He shoved her to the side, ensuring he had Julia's complete attention. He lowered his voice, dropping the booming fatherly persona and leaning in close with a desperate whisper. He flashed a greedy, familiar grin, assuming this reunion meant his catastrophic financial problems were instantly solved. He cleared his throat and smoothly transitioned to business. He brought up his failing company, casually mentioning the numerous emails he had sent the anonymous angel investor over the past 3 months. He chuckled nervously, stating that since the money was staying in the family, there was no need for any more tedious formalities or corporate paperwork. He looked Julia right in the eye, his desperation naked, and asked if she would approve the massive capital transfer tonight so he could save his firm by morning. Julia did not smile. She did not flinch. She slowly opened the clasp of her designer clutch and reached inside. She pulled out a thick, meticulously bound legal document bearing the exact registered corporate logo of Thomas's logistics company. She held the heavy stack of papers up, letting him see the bright red foreclosure stamps marking the front page. "I didn't approve the bailout, Thomas. I bought your debt directly from the bank." Thomas stared at the thick stack of papers in Julia's hands, his eyes locked onto the bright red foreclosure stamps, as if they were written in a foreign language. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as his brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of his defeat. Buying the debt meant she owned his entire logistics firm. She owned every single leased delivery truck, every warehouse, and every outstanding invoice he desperately needed to keep his head above water. He reached out with a trembling hand, wanting to snatch the documents away, to prove this was all a cruel nightmare. But his arms felt too heavy. Julia did not offer him an inch of sympathy. She looked at the man who had spent decades tearing down her confidence and calmly informed him that as his sole remaining creditor, she was officially calling in the debt immediately. She explained with the cool precision of a corporate executive that he was in breach of countless financial covenants. Because he had drained his operational accounts to post bail for Brittany's felony arrest, his company no longer met the minimum liquidity requirements outlined in his loan agreements. Therefore, as of this exact moment, his logistics firm was officially and unavoidably bankrupt. The absolute finality of her words hung heavily between them. Thomas staggered backward, as if struck in the chest. He bumped hard against a cocktail table, rattling the crystal champagne flutes resting on the pristine white linen. His breath came in short, jagged wheezes as he gripped the edge of the table to keep from collapsing onto the polished marble floor. The grand illusion of his wealth, his arrogant pride evaporated into nothingness. A few yards away, hovering near the edge of the stunned crowd, a tall man with perfectly styled hair had been watching the entire exchange unfold. Kyle Brittany's handsome status-obsessed fiancé had stepped out of the VIP lounge when the shouting began. He had stood in the shadows, sipping a cocktail, waiting for Thomas to exert his usual aggressive dominance and clean up whatever mess Brittany had dragged them into this time. But as Kyle listened to Julia meticulously dismantle his future father-in-law's entire financial empire, his perfectly cultivated smile vanished. Kyle was a man who calculated every move in his life based on profit and social leverage. He had proposed not out of some profound love, but because her family represented a golden ticket to the elite suburban lifestyle he inherently deserved. Now looking at the sweating, hyperventilating wreck of a man gasping for air against a cocktail table, Kyle realized there was no golden ticket. There was no trust fund. There was no logistics empire waiting to be inherited. There was only massive, inescapable debt, public humiliation, and the very real threat of federal prison time hanging over his screaming, unhinged fiancée. Kyle slowly walked forward, his jaw set in a hard, pragmatic line. Brittany saw him approaching and let out a desperate, sobbing gasp. She reached out toward him, her tear-streaked face pleading for him to defend her, to wrap his arms around her, and tell her everything was going to be fine. She babbled his name, reaching for the lapels of his expensive tuxedo. Kyle did not embrace her. He smoothly caught her wrists and firmly pushed her hands away from his chest. He looked at Brittany, then looked at the shattered remains of her parents, his eyes cold and entirely transactional. He reached down and slid the heavy gold engagement ring off his pinky finger where he had been holding it while getting it resized. Without uttering a single word of comfort, Kyle placed the expensive diamond ring directly onto the cocktail table next to Thomas's trembling hand. He turned his back on the weeping woman he had promised to marry and calmly walked out of the ballroom, his footsteps fading into the stunned silence. Brittany let out a gut-wrenching, agonizing shriek as she watched Kyle disappear through the heavy brass doors. She lunged toward the table, snatching up the discarded ring and clutching it to her chest as she collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor in a puddle of ruined silk and smeared makeup. The sound of her eldest daughter's complete emotional destruction finally shattered the last remaining fragments of Linda's fragile reality. The vicious matriarch who had spent her entire life evaluating people based solely on their bank accounts suddenly found herself standing in a room full of billionaires with absolutely nothing left to her name. The crushing weight of their total destitution pressed down on her shoulders, breaking her arrogant posture and crushing her pride into unsalvageable dust. Linda let out a low, whimpering moan that grew into a frantic, hyperventilating sob. Her knees gave out completely. She dropped heavily to the marble floor right in the middle of the gala, the loud thud echoing through the silent crowd. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, her expensive evening gown snagging on the polished stone. She reached out with desperate shaking hands and grabbed fistfuls of the fabric of Julia's elegant dress. Linda looked up at the daughter she had emotionally tortured for years, her face a horrific mask of smeared mascara and flowing tears. She begged Julia for mercy, her voice raw and cracking with absolute terror. She sobbed that they had lost the company, they had lost their savings, and they were going to lose everything. She pleaded with Julia to look past all the harsh things they had said and done. She clutched the fabric of Julia's gown tighter, her knuckles turning white as she begged her to at least let them keep the family home. Linda wailed that it was the only thing they had left in the world, the very house they had thrown Julia out of with nothing but a garbage bag just a few short weeks ago. She cried that they would have nowhere to go, no place to sleep, and they would be completely ruined if they were thrown out onto the street. Julia did not try to pull away from her mother's desperate grip immediately. She stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman weeping hysterically at her feet. She remembered the freezing rain soaking through her clothes on the night she was exiled from that pristine suburban sanctuary. She remembered the sound of the heavy front door slamming shut, locking her out in the dark, while this exact same woman watched her shiver from the warmth of the living room window. Slowly and with absolute deliberate composure, Julia reached down and firmly detached Linda's trembling fingers from the hem of her gown. She took a smooth, elegant step backward, ensuring there was a clear physical boundary between her and the sprawling, sobbing wreckage of her family. She calmly brushed a microscopic piece of lint from her dress, her movements unhurried and precise. She reached back into her designer clutch, her fingers closing around one final heavily stamped document. She pulled it out and held it up under the bright crystal light of the chandeliers. She looked directly into Thomas's wide, bloodshot eyes, and then down at her weeping mother. She kept her voice perfectly level, letting the devastating reality of her words sink deep into their bones. You leveraged the house as collateral for your business loans, Thomas, which means when I bought your debt, I bought the deed to your house. Thomas stared at the heavy parchment paper in Julia's hand, the reality of her words crashing down on him with suffocating weight. He reached out with trembling fingers, but his arms felt completely paralyzed. Julia lowered the deed and calmly held out a second document, letting it drop into Linda's violently shaking hands. Linda stared through her tears at the crisp, black ink, her breath hitching in her throat, as she read the bold lettering across the top. It was a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice. The address listed was the pristine suburban estate she had spent decades meticulously decorating and defending as her ultimate status symbol. Julia looked down at the woman still kneeling on the marble floor. Julia's face was utterly devoid of pity or anger. It was a mask of cold, calculated indifference. She leaned down slightly, bringing her face close to her mother's ear. When she spoke, her voice dropped to a chilling whisper that perfectly mirrored the exact tone Linda had used against her on that freezing night weeks ago. Get out, beggars. I need the space for my new walk-in closet. Linda gasped, as if all the oxygen had just been sucked out of the room. She dropped the eviction notice onto the floor and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ugly, unrestrained sobs. Thomas stood entirely frozen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Brittany remained slumped against the wall, clutching Kyle's discarded engagement ring, her vacant eyes staring blankly at nothing. Julia stood up straight, smoothing the delicate fabric of her gown with a graceful, unhurried motion. She offered her family one final dismissive glance before turning away, leaving them completely shattered in the dust of their own spectacular ruin. The mayor gave a sharp, definitive nod to the chief of security. The broad-shouldered guards immediately moved in, forming a tight, unyielding perimeter around the weeping family. The head of security spoke in a low, firm voice that carried no room for argument. He informed Thomas that they were officially trespassing on private property and ordered them to leave the premises immediately. Thomas tried to muster some remaining shred of dignity, attempting to brush off his rumpled suit jacket, but his hands were shaking too badly. He reached down and grabbed Linda by the arm, roughly hauling his sobbing wife to her feet. The guard stepped forward, physically guiding them away from the VIP lounge and pointing them toward the grand exit. The walk back through the glittering ballroom was an agonizing parade of absolute humiliation. Hundreds of the wealthiest and most influential people in the state stood in silence, watching the family being marched out like common criminals. There were no sympathetic glances, no polite murmurs of concern. The city's elite simply parted like the Red Sea, pulling their expensive gowns and tailored tuxedos out of the way to avoid any physical contact with the disgraced trio. Thomas kept his eyes locked firmly on the heavy brass doors at the far end of the room, his face burning with a fiery, consuming shame. Every step felt like walking through thick mud. He could feel the collective judgment of the crowd pressing down on his back. These were the very people he had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to impress, the corporate titans he had relentlessly courted, and the venture capitalists he had practically begged for validation. Now they were all watching him being thrown out into the cold street, completely stripped of his wealth, his business, and his pride. Linda kept her head bowed, her tears staining the front of her ruined dress as she stumbled alongside her husband. Brittany dragged her feet, her mind still violently rejecting the total collapse of her privileged existence. When they finally reached the exit, the heavy brass doors were pulled open by the staff, and the security guards forcefully ushered them out into the damp, freezing night air. The doors slammed shut behind them with a loud final click, echoing the absolute termination of their lives in high society. Inside the warm, brilliantly lit ballroom, the suffocating tension instantly vanished. The elegant jazz orchestra smoothly resumed playing, filling the vaulted space with lively, sophisticated music. Julia walked back toward the center of the party, her posture relaxed and triumphant. A waiter in a crisp white uniform immediately approached, offering a silver tray lined with crystal flutes. Julia smiled gracefully and lifted a glass of champagne. The moment her hand touched the glass, the crowd of investors, politicians, and corporate executives swarmed around her. They eagerly pressed forward, their faces glowing with genuine admiration and respect. Powerful banking executives practically shoved each other out of the way just to offer their congratulations on her brilliant keynote address. Venture capitalists who had previously ignored her father's desperate emails now begged Julia for a simple 5-minute meeting, pitching lucrative partnerships and massive urban development deals. She stood in the center of the glittering room, effortlessly navigating the complex social dynamics, her financial execution of her toxic family flawlessly complete. She had won, and she had done it entirely on her own terms. Over the course of the next month, the remaining dominoes of the family's carefully constructed empire finally finished falling, crashing down with brutal, unforgiving momentum. The local news media had caught wind of Brittany's felony arrest at the downtown server facility, and the story had quickly become a sensational scandal within the local real estate community. Brittany sat in a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room at the state licensing board, her expensive designer suit hanging loosely on her shrinking frame. The board members sat across from her, their expressions stern and uncompromising. They reviewed the detailed police report outlining her use of illegal lockpicking tools and her aggressive destruction of private property. Because the charges involved felony corporate espionage and breaking and entering, the regulatory committee ruled that she fundamentally lacked the moral character required to represent clients or handle significant financial transactions. The chairman of the board struck his gavel and officially declared that Brittany's real estate license was permanently revoked. She walked out of the administrative building completely stripped of her professional identity, her lucrative career evaporated into thin air. Without her license and with a looming criminal trial threatening to send her to a federal penitentiary, she was utterly unemployable. Across town, Thomas and Linda were facing the grim, inescapable reality of their 30-day eviction notice. The bank had officially seized their logistics company, liquidating every remaining asset to cover the massive debts Thomas had accumulated. Without operational funds to sustain their lifestyle, their financial accounts dried up. The pristine suburban house was no longer theirs. Because they could not afford moving boxes, Linda was forced to pack her entire life into heavy black trash bags. Thomas dragged the lumpy bags out to his rusted sedan, shoving them into the trunk. They took one final look at the magnificent house they had ruthlessly protected, knowing they would never step foot inside ever again. Thomas slowly drove away toward the industrial outskirts. They pulled up to a decaying concrete building surrounded by cracked pavement. They had signed a lease on a tiny, run-down and unheated apartment. Thomas carried the trash bags up 3 dark flights of stairs. He pushed open the flimsy door, revealing a cramped, dirty living space. Linda walked inside, shivering violently in the freezing, bitter draft. The harsh, cold reality of their new existence settled over them like a suffocating blanket. The apartment smelled of mold and stale smoke, a stench clinging to the peeling wallpaper. There was no furniture, just black trash bags containing the pathetic remnants of their former lives. Thomas dropped the last bag onto the scuffed linoleum floor and leaned against the doorframe, gasping for air. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his untouchable status, was stained and wrinkled. Brittany stood in the cramped room, staring blankly at the ceiling. She had not spoken since the licensing board revoked her credentials earlier that afternoon. Without her career, and with the impending felony trial looming closer every day, she had completely shut down. Linda wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth chattering as the freezing draft blew through the poorly sealed window panes. She looked at her husband, her eyes wide with desperate panic. They had exhausted every favor, drained every hidden account, and alienated every wealthy friend they ever had. Their social circle had abandoned them the moment the bankruptcy became public. They were entirely isolated, utterly destitute, and out of options. Thomas met his wife's terrified gaze and slowly nodded. The unspoken realization hung heavily between them. There was only one person left in the entire world who had the financial power to save them. They had to go to Julia. The drive across town was a silent, miserable journey through a torrential downpour. The rusted sedan Thomas had secured from a shady used car lot struggled against the slick roads, the windshield wipers squeaking loudly as they pushed the heavy rain aside. Brittany sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the blurred city lights, her expression completely hollow. As they crossed into the exclusive community where Julia now lived, the smooth, freshly paved roads offered a harsh contrast to the pothole-filled streets of their new neighborhood. The massive oak trees lining the avenue provided a canopy of deep shadows, hiding the sprawling mansions of the elite residents. Thomas gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He slowed the vehicle to a crawl as they approached the towering wrought iron gates of Julia's $4.5 million estate. A massive stone wall surrounded the grounds, completely obscuring the main house from the street. High-definition security cameras were mounted on the stone pillars, their red recording lights blinking steadily through the sheets of rain. Thomas parked the car on the shoulder of the road. He turned off the engine and looked at his wife and daughter. They knew exactly what they had to do. They had to swallow every last ounce of their pride and beg for mercy. Thomas pushed his door open and stepped out into the freezing storm. Linda and Brittany followed instantly, soaked to the bone as the heavy rain battered against them. The wind whipped their wet hair across their faces as they stumbled toward the glowing intercom panel mounted on the stone pillar. Thomas pressed the brass button, holding it down with a trembling finger. A sharp electronic buzz echoed from the speaker, followed by absolute silence. He pressed it again, harder this time, desperately hoping someone was listening. Linda pushed past him, her face completely drenched, her makeup running down her cheeks in muddy streaks. She grabbed the edge of the intercom box and looked directly up into the glowing red lens of the security camera. She began to cry, her voice cracking as she begged Julia to answer the gate. She sobbed that they were freezing, that they had nowhere else to turn, and that they were sorry for everything. When the intercom remained silent, the desperation in Linda's voice pitched into a frantic, hysterical wail. She tried to weaponize guilt one last time, screaming into the rain that family loyalty had to mean something. She cried that a daughter could not simply abandon her own flesh and blood to freeze in the streets. She wailed about forgiveness, demanding that Julia show compassion and open the gates. Thomas joined the pathetic chorus, his voice hoarse as he shouted over the roaring wind. He pleaded for a meeting, a small loan, just a tiny sliver of mercy to help them get back on their feet. He promised he would pay her back every single cent with interest. He swore he was a changed man and that he finally recognized her brilliance. Brittany stepped forward, pressing her hands against the cold iron bars of the gate. She cried out for her big sister, begging Julia to remember the times they had shared as children, completely ignoring the decades of vicious bullying she had inflicted. The three of them stood shoulder to shoulder in the torrential downpour, a ragged, broken family screaming into the unfeeling storm. Inside the massive estate, Julia sat on a plush velvet sofa in her expansive living room. A large fire roared in the marble fireplace, casting a golden glow across the polished hardwood floors. Mounted on the wall above her sleek oak desk was a bank of state-of-the-art security monitors. She watched the high-definition feeds with complete emotional detachment. She saw Thomas, Linda, and Brittany standing in the pouring rain, their faces contorted in desperate agony as they screamed into the intercom camera. She watched her mother weeping, her father shouting empty promises, and her sister gripping the iron gates like a caged animal. The audio feed piped their frantic begging voices directly into the quiet room. Julia took a slow sip of her tea, letting the hot liquid warm her throat. She felt absolutely nothing for the people sobbing on her screens. There was no lingering guilt, no sudden surge of familial obligation, and no desire to offer them even a fraction of a penny. They were reaping the exact harvest they had spent a lifetime planting. For a moment, Julia considered simply muting the audio feed and letting them scream into the storm until they finally gave up and drove back to their squalid apartment. It would be the easiest option. But as she watched them shivering against the iron bars, desperately trying to manipulate her emotions with hollow cries of family loyalty, a different thought took root. Ignoring them would allow them to maintain a microscopic sliver of hope. It would allow them to believe she simply had not heard them, or that she was too cowardly to face them directly. She needed to sever that final lingering thread of delusion. She needed to look them directly in the eyes and deliver her final verdict face to face, ensuring they understood with absolute clarity that this was the definitive end. Julia set her mug down. She stood up, her posture perfectly straight, and walked across the expansive living room toward the grand foyer. She grabbed a large black umbrella by the heavy front door. She signaled the gatehouse security detail via her wall panel, instructing them to stand down. She would handle this personally. She stepped out into the stormy night. The very large canopy of her umbrella sprang open, shielding her from the torrential downpour. She walked down the long, winding, illuminated driveway, her footsteps steady and unhurried against the wet pavement. She moved with the calm, absolute authority of a woman who had conquered her past and secured her future, heading straight toward the gate to meet her ruined family for one final devastating confrontation. By the time Julia reached the end of the illuminated driveway, the last of their performance had collapsed into raw desperation. Julia approached the towering wrought iron gates, the steady rhythm of the rain drumming heavily against the taut canvas of her large black umbrella. She halted just a few feet away from the thick metal bars, standing perfectly pristine and dry, while the three people on the other side looked like drowned rats. The contrast between them was absolute and undeniable. Thomas, Linda, and Brittany were shivering violently, their soaked clothes clinging to their trembling frames. When Linda saw her daughter materialize from the shadows, a fresh wave of hysterical sobs tore through her chest. She practically threw herself against the wet iron, shoving her hands through the narrow gaps between the bars. Her fingers flailed desperately, clawing at the empty air as she tried to grab hold of Julia's coat, her arm anything she could reach. Julia did not flinch. She simply took one deliberate, measured step backward, keeping herself entirely out of her mother's frantic reach. She watched with cold, clinical detachment as Linda's hands dropped in defeat, sliding down the slick metal bars. Thomas gripped the iron next to his weeping wife, his knuckles bone white from the immense pressure. He leaned his forehead against the cold gate, the heavy rain plastering his thinning hair to his scalp. He begged Julia to let them inside, promising that they could sit down like a real family and figure out a mutually beneficial arrangement. He swore he would work for her, that he would earn back every single penny, and that they just needed a warm roof over their heads for a few days to regroup. Brittany chimed in her voice, a high whining screech over the wind. She cried about the freezing apartment, complaining that the heater was broken and the floor was covered in grime. She pleaded for her big sister to show some basic human decency, weaponizing the concept of forgiveness, and demanding that Julia let go of the past because family was supposed to stick together through hard times. Julia stood in absolute silence, letting them exhaust their pathetic repertoire of guilt trips and empty promises. She listened as their screams bounced off the thick stone walls of her property, their words carrying no weight, no power, and no influence over her whatsoever. When their voices finally began to crack and give out from the sheer exertion of shouting into the storm, Julia slowly lowered her umbrella just enough to look them directly in the eyes. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp, cutting resonance that sliced effortlessly through the howling wind and the pouring rain. She told them they had absolutely no right to stand outside her home and demand loyalty. She reminded them of the day she had proudly brought home her acceptance letter to her dream university, only to discover that Thomas and Linda had drained the entirety of her college savings account to buy Brittany a luxury sports car. She recounted the endless, suffocating years of psychological torment, the daily insults about her appearance, her intelligence, and her overall worth. She spoke of the hundreds of family dinners where she was treated as an unwanted burden, forced to sit in silence while they showered Brittany with unearned praise and expensive gifts. She did not raise her voice, but every single word struck them like a physical blow. She reminded Brittany of the server room, the malicious setup, and the calculated attempt to send her to federal prison for a crime she did not commit. She pointed out the sheer audacity of Thomas trying to force her to sign a false confession, fully prepared to sacrifice her entire future just to save his own failing logistics empire. Julia looked at her mother, who was still weeping against the iron bars, and completely dismantled the illusion of her maternal love. She told Linda that there was no sudden awakening, no genuine regret, and absolutely no maternal instinct driving this desperate visit. She calmly stated that they only started treating her like a human being the exact moment they realized her net worth eclipsed theirs. They did not love her. They only loved the billions of dollars she commanded, and their current groveling was nothing more than the pathetic panic of parasites who had just been forcefully detached from their host. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, washing away the last remnants of their fake suburban facade. Thomas tried to interrupt, stammering out a weak defense, claiming they were just trying to give her tough love to make her strong, but Julia cut him off with a single sharp look. She told him that tough love did not involve leaving a daughter homeless in a freezing storm with her belongings shoved into a garbage bag. She reminded him that true family did not actively plot to destroy one of their own for financial gain. The complete lack of emotion in her voice terrified them more than any screaming match ever could. It proved that the bridge was not just burned, it was entirely eradicated. Julia took another step back, her eyes sweeping over the three shivering broken figures huddled together in the mud outside her gates. She felt a profound, absolute sense of closure wash over her. The frightened, desperate girl who had spent her life begging for their approval was completely gone, replaced by a formidable woman who recognized her own infinite value. She looked directly at her mother, then her father, and finally her sister. "You didn't want a daughter," Julia said, her voice cutting through the rain. "You wanted a punching bag and you lost her." Without waiting for a single response, Julia deliberately turned her back on them. She looked toward the small illuminated guardhouse situated just inside the massive stone wall. She made direct eye contact with the head of her private security detail, who was standing quietly by the window watching the exchange closely. She gave him a single definitive nod silently, instructing him to ensure these people never set foot near her property ever again. The guard nodded back respectfully, his hand resting firmly on his radio, to confirm the absolute finality of her silent command. Julia began the long walk back up the long driveway, her large umbrella shielding her from the raging storm, her steps steady and deeply resolute. Behind her, the desperate shouting finally ceased. The crushing realization that they had truly lost everything, including their favorite victim, finally shattered their remaining resolve. Thomas, Linda, and Brittany slowly turned away from the towering iron gates. They trudged back toward their rusted, sputtering car, their heads bowed against the relentless wind. They climbed into the damp, freezing vehicle and drove away into the dark night, completely ostracized, utterly ruined, and forever forgotten by the world they once ruled. By morning, the storm had passed, but Julia had one final piece of unfinished business waiting across the street. The loud grinding of diesel engines shattered the quiet tranquility of the upscale neighborhood. 3 massive yellow excavators crawled along the pristine asphalt. From her sprawling master balcony, Julia took another slow, deliberate sip of her espresso. The bitter flavor of the dark roast perfectly grounded her in the present moment. The storm from the previous night had washed away the oppressive humidity, leaving the morning air sharp and incredibly clear. She leaned against the cool glass of the balcony railing, tracking the lead bulldozer as it made a sweeping turn into the paved driveway of the house across the valley. It was the house she had grown up in, the sprawling estate that had served as the stage for decades of psychological torture. When she purchased the debt and acquired the deed, the financial advisors had practically begged her to list the property. Flipping the estate would have yielded a massive profit. They assumed she would simply sell the asset and walk away. But Julia had zero intention of selling it, and she had no desire to ever spend another night within those walls. The house was a monument to Thomas and Linda's toxic vanity. Every marble countertop and crystal chandelier had been purchased to project an illusion of superiority while rotting from the inside. To sell it would let their legacy survive. To live in it would trap herself in a mausoleum of her adolescent misery. There was only one acceptable solution. Down below, the construction foreman stepped out of his truck holding a handheld radio. He looked up toward Julia's distant balcony, shielding his eyes from the morning sun. He raised his hand silently, asking for the authorization to begin. Julia did not hesitate. She lifted her free hand and gave a single wave. The foreman nodded, spoke sharply into his radio, and stepped back. The lead excavator roared to life, its hydraulic arm rising high into the crisp air. The steel bucket swung forward with terrifying momentum and smashed directly into the slate roof of the colonial home. The sickening crunch of shattering wood and tearing drywall echoed across the valley, a violent symphony of destruction. Julia watched as the heavy steel teeth ripped through the master bedroom window, completely obliterating the space where Linda used to scheme her social climbing. Another excavator moved in from the side, its treads tearing up the manicured lawn Thomas had obsessed over. It slammed into the side of the house, taking down the exterior wall of the formal dining room. A massive cloud of dust plumed into the air as the expensive brick facade crumbled into a heap of rubble. Julia watched the destruction without an ounce of regret. With every beam that snapped and wall that collapsed, a heavy weight lifted from her shoulders. She remembered sitting at that dining room table, listening to her parents tell her she would never amount to anything. She remembered the front door, now crushed under a fallen support beam, where she had been thrown out into the rain with nothing but a trash bag. Seeing the physical structure of her trauma reduced to dust and splintered wood was the most profound therapy she could have imagined. It was not just a demolition, it was an exorcism. The ghosts of her past were being forcibly evicted, ground into dirt by the relentless power of heavy machinery. As the second story of the house collapsed in on itself, Julia turned her gaze, looking down at the small glass patio table next to her. Resting beneath a crystal paperweight was a thick set of architectural blueprints. They were not plans for another luxury mansion. They were the schematics for the property's immediate future. Once the debris was cleared and the ground-leveled construction would begin on a state-of-the-art community center. Julia had spent the last 2 months working with urban planners to design a facility that would actively dismantle the financial barriers her parents had tried to use against her. The center was designed to teach advanced computer science software engineering and complex coding architectures to young women from underprivileged backgrounds. It would feature open-concept computer labs, collaborative workspaces, and a career placement division. More importantly, Julia had legally mandated that every program seminar and certification offered at the facility would be free of charge. She was fully funding the entire operation through a private trust. Her parents had weaponized their wealth, refusing to pay for her college education in a deliberate attempt to keep her submissive. They had drained her savings to buy a sports car for the golden child actively trying to destroy her future. Now she was going to use the very ground they once ruled to provide unlimited education to young women who actually deserved a chance. She was going to empower the exact kind of brilliant girls that Thomas and Linda had always looked down upon. It was the ultimate counter to decades of manufactured scarcity and emotional neglect. The roar of the excavators continued a steady rhythmic thrum of progress. Julia breathed in the fresh morning air, feeling a profound peace settling deep into her bones. The frantic, desperate energy that had driven her for so many years, the burning need to prove herself, to escape the suffocating grip of her family, was finally gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, absolute certainty. She had navigated the brutal corporate landscape, built a technological empire, and flawlessly outmaneuvered the people who had tried to destroy her. She looked out over her own sprawling estate, taking in the manicured gardens, the pristine pool, and the towering iron gates that protected her sanctuary. She was safe. She was untouchable. The people who had hurt her were waking up in a freezing, rundown apartment stripped of their wealth and their dignity. They would never be able to reach her again. They would never be able to manipulate her, diminish her accomplishments, or use her as a scapegoat for their miserable failures. The heavy toxic chain that had bound her to their dysfunction was shattered. She was finally unconditionally free. A soft melodic chime broke through the quiet tranquility of the balcony. Julia glanced down at her mobile phone resting on the glass table. The screen illuminated, displaying a crisp automated notification from her private wealth management firm. It was a routine alert, one that arrived like clockwork on the same day every single month. Monthly corporate dividend deposit $100,000. Julia stared at the massive number for a brief moment. She remembered the nights she had gone hungry, the freezing apartment she had shared when she was first starting out, and the sheer terror of not knowing how she was going to pay for her basic survival. Now $100,000 was simply passive income, a routine dividend generated by the tech firm she had built with her own 2 hands. She reached out and picked up the phone. She did not smile with arrogant greed or gloat over the staggering amount of money. She simply acknowledged it with a quiet sense of satisfaction. With a casual swipe of her thumb, she cleared the notification from the screen. She pulled down the settings menu and firmly tapped the crescent moon icon, switching the device to Do Not Disturb. She set the phone face down on the table, silencing the outside world completely. Julia picked up her espresso, turned her face toward the warm morning sun, and smiled at her empire. The story of Julia is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the profound importance of breaking generational cycles of abuse. Julia's ultimate triumph was not merely the physical demolition of her parents' home, it was the complete dismantling of the toxic power they held over her life. For years, she was the family's scapegoat, subjected to emotional manipulation, financial sabotage, and systemic cruelty. Yet instead of allowing that trauma to turn her into a bitter, resentful reflection of her abusers, she channeled her pain into an unstoppable drive for success and independence. The greatest lesson we can learn from Julia's journey is that the best revenge is a life well lived. By choosing to build a community center that provides free education to underprivileged women, Julia actively rebelled against the hoarding and weaponization of wealth modeled by her parents. She took the very ground that represented her darkest memories and transformed it into a beacon of hope and empowerment. True strength does not lie in punishing those who hurt you, but in stripping them of their power and ensuring that others do not have to endure the same suffering. Furthermore, Julia teaches us that it is entirely acceptable to set hard, uncompromising boundaries with toxic family members. Shared genetics do not give anyone a free pass to exploit or belittle you. Protecting your peace, your mental health, and your future is not selfish, it is entirely necessary for your survival. Share your experiences of walking away from a toxic environment in the comments below. If Julia's journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering stories. Remember, your past does not define your future, and you have the power to build your own empire.